Some employees don't confront problems, they actually plant them. And that distinction matters more than most leaders actually realize. So, passive aggression is one of the most corrosive forms of toxic behavior that leaders deal with because it rarely triggers alarms. It does not shout, it sighs, it complies halfway, and it smiles while resisting. So, leaders have a tendency to miss this because nothing is overtly wrong. Nothing overtly wrong is actually happening. And the damage therefore shows up later. It shows up in morale, shows up in trust, and it shows up in momentum. So let's have a real honest conversation about what it's like for leaders dealing with difficult people. I'm Brenda Neckvatal, and I help the strongest leaders deal with the messiest people. So early in my career, I underestimated passive aggression. I told myself that it was harmless. I chucked it up to personality, and I assumed it would work itself out if I stayed positive and I focused on results. Well, what I learned later and learned the hard way is this: passive aggression is not mild, it's slow. And slow damage is harder to detect, harder to stop, and harder to repair. Now, the pattern is subtle, but it's also really consistent. So, an employee agrees publicly, but resists privately. And like deadlines are technically met, but with just enough friction to create problems. So, feedback is now acknowledged, then it's quietly ignored. So support is offered with a tone that signals resentment. And when asked directly, everything's fine. And that response is what often traps leaders because nothing sounds confrontational. Nothing sounds defiant. Nothing sounds serious enough to address. So leaders move on and the pattern continues. And this is where dealing with difficult people becomes really confusing because leaders sense something's off, but they just can't point to a single incident. Like nothing is severe enough to escalate, everything is disruptive enough to drain energy. But over time, leaders start compensating. They follow up more, they check in more, they carry more weight. And not because they want to, but because things keep slipping just enough to require it. This is how passive aggression transfers workload upwards. And leaders often don't realize it's happening until they're absolutely exhausted. So teams feel this immediately. And they watch who gets away with quiet resistance. And they feel the tension in meetings. They notice the difference between what is said and what's actually happening. So people start choosing their words really carefully, not to be clear, but to be safe. And you'll see the group dynamic shift happening. Direct communicators get frustrated, cautious ones start to retreat, and collaboration totally weakens because no one trusts what's being said out loud. Leaders will often misinterpret this as disengagement. It's not, it's guardedness. Now, my turning point came when I realized something critical, that passive aggression survives on one thing, and that is avoidance. And as long as leaders focus on outcomes and ignore behavior, the pattern will always continue. And as long as leaders accept half compliance as effort, resistance stays hidden. And once I start naming the behavior calmly, the dynamic started to change. Not dramatically, consistently. Because strong leaders do not chase tone, they track follow through. They do not debate how something was meant. They address the gap between the words and the action. They pay attention to patterns, not excuses. So passive aggression loses power when leaders stop letting ambiguity linger. And this is where many leaders start to hesitate because they worry that calling this out will actually create conflict. And very much the opposite is true, right? Avoiding it allows conflict to spread underground. Unaddressed tension does not disappear, it leaks. And it leaks into sarcasm, into silence, into subtle resistance. So when leaders bring it into the open with clarity, tension has a tendency to release. Not because people love being confronted, because expectations become real again. And this isn't about being harsh, it's about being specific. Instead of saying, I feel like you're not on board, strong leaders will say, we agreed on X. What happened was Y. So help me understand this gap. Help me understand what happened. And that shift matters because it moves the conversation out of emotion and into behavior. And the cost leaders overlook is cultural erosion. So, passive aggression actually teaches people that honesty is optional and it rewards indirectness and it penalizes clarity. So, over time, the culture becomes polite but brittle, and people stop raising issues directly because they don't believe it will ever matter. Then they stop trusting alignment because words and actions don't matter. So leaders then start to feel like they're managing an atmosphere instead of performance. So if progress keeps stalling for reasons that you can't fully explain, pay attention. Passive aggression does not block progress outright, it just slows it until the momentum disappears, until everything takes more effort than it should, until leaders are working harder just to maintain the same output. So your team is watching how you handle this behavior. They learn whether clarity is valued or whether avoidance is tolerated. Because culture is shaped by what leaders are willing to name, not by what they hope will resolve itself. And this is why strong cultures are always comfortable, because they're clear. And if you want to address passive aggression without escalating or becoming confrontational, you don't need sharper instincts. You just need sharper structure. And you also need consistency. So, structure that focuses on observable behavior, consistency that reinforces expectations every time the pattern appears. And this is exactly the kind of situation that leaders second guess in the moment. Nothing will feel urgent enough to interrupt. Nothing feels obvious enough to call it out. And yet the damage compounds quietly. And this is also one of the 100 real leadership scenarios inside of my app. And it exists for moments like this, moments when leaders are dealing with difficult people, toxic behaviors, or group dynamics that do not come with a script. Leaders use it to think clearly, they use it to choose the right response and avoid getting it wrong when it matters. So you can access this at askbrendahow.com because passive aggression only works when leaders let it stay unnamed. And the moment that you bring clarity to it, culture stops eroding and starts healing. Not louder, not harsher, clearer. And that clarity is what strong cultures are built on.